Welcome to Pocket Economics, a guide to changing lives. It's our podcast about the ideas that are shaping the EBRD regions and beyond. I'm Vanora Bennett, and today we're discussing the challenges faced by refugees and the countries and communities that host them. We'll be looking at how international organisations and the private sector can support them both. Our guest today is Daphne Jayasinghe, Economic Recovery and Development Policy Advisor at the International Rescue Committee. Now, we usually start our discussions on pocket economics by defining our terms. So who actually qualifies as a refugee?
A refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. He or she has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group.
Daphne, that's the UN definition of refugees. Does it make sense to you? Do we need to add asylum seekers or internally displaced persons to the mix too? Or are those old distinctions between categories even relevant anymore?
Well, I think it's very important as a humanitarian organisation to recognise the broad range of people that are affected by conflict, persecution and disaster and the vulnerabilities that they face. And so the IRC does work with asylum seekers, with vulnerable populations, with host communities and with internally displaced populations as well. And in fact, if you take the UNHCR definition of forcibly displaced persons, that extends to 65.6 million individuals at the end of 2016. So that's a much bigger number than the number of refugees alone.
Yeah, that is a huge number. Wow, 65.5 million people. In some of the countries where the EBRD works, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon and Greece were the ones that come to my mind. They're hosting millions of refugees at the moment. How are those countries coping? Are they coping?
Well, those countries have extended enormous generosity to refugees by opening their doors. And that has taken a real huge toll on their infrastructure, on public services. For Jordan, for example, they've increased their population by 20%. And so, yes, it has been a struggle and it can be. And I think the global community really has a responsibility to recognise that that generosity and that responsibility that these countries have taken as host countries and really extend the support that they need to build their infrastructure, to also think about the unemployment of their host communities, to think about the knock-on effect on their host communities as well as the refugees and support them in hosting refugees. And I think there's a number of ways to do that. I mean, there's the kind of immediate response that is being supported, the short-term basic needs or survival that people need support in. But there's also the longer-term economic inclusion work that those host countries are currently exploring and supporting. And there's a real responsibility from donors, from multilaterals like the EBRD to sort of work with those host governments to explore ways to economically include refugees.
That's very interesting. I like the idea that the world should be sharing the burden a bit more and maybe a bit more intelligently. Let's come back to the idea of economic inclusion. Could you maybe just tell me now how the current number of refugees that you're looking at compare with those in recent decades?
Well, for refugees specifically, so not the forcibly displaced persons category that I mentioned before, at the end of 2016, it was around 17.2 million. That was up by 1 million from the end of 2015. What we've seen in the recent past is huge numbers displaced. So we saw the millionth person crossing the border in Bangladesh at the end of last year, and the consequences for displacement in Bangladesh. Bangladesh, again, hosting huge numbers of people. We've seen mass migration into Europe as well. And so the numbers have an increase, but the scale of the problem is increasing.
I see. I've seen that you've written that the average refugee is displaced for about a decade. So there is an immediate challenge in providing them with food and shelter and so on. But there's also this long-term challenge, isn't there? Because many of them are basically here to stay wherever they end up. And so this is where we come back to your thoughts about economic inclusion.
Sure, yeah, no, that's right. I think what we have been seeing is that the average displacement can be 20 to 30 years for a refugee. And so we do have to think about both the immediate short-term needs, the survival or basic needs that we need to support displaced populations with. That might be obviously food and water and shelter, but there's also the longer term needs, the needs around opportunities, economic opportunities, sort of rebuilding their lives. The IRC, we like to talk about working across the arc of the crisis from that immediate emergency response to integration and resettlement. And so we do think very carefully about how we can support the communities we work with in rebuilding their lives, in their quest for a job, in their opportunities, in training, in apprenticeships. You know, what is it that it takes to access the labour market? And so we do that in a number of ways. We have, for example, in Lebanon and Jordan, we have livelihood centres where we work with vulnerable communities, including host populations, to train them in enterprise development, in CV writing, in kind of the things that we take for granted about finding a job, but finding a job in a new country, but also combining that with particular vulnerabilities. So we work with a lot of women, for example, who might need support for gender-based violence. They might need legal advice. They might need advice about how to access childcare facilities. They might need a creche. Those are all things that we incorporate into our livelihood centre. And I visited a community centre in Jordan just the week before last. And interestingly, that's become known as the Hope Centre. It's not given that name by us, but it's been given that title because it's a centre where people can go and access health services. They can go and get advice on how to set up their enterprise. There's a recreation room. They can get their hair done if they wanted to. You know, there's a lot of opportunities to come and just regain some sense of normality. And that's very, very important for people who've gone through a lot of trauma and crisis.
So it sounds like it's the end of the road for the old-fashioned refugee camp. But what do local people think in a host country when all these job seekers, having acquired new skills in centres, come looking for jobs on their patch?
No, there's absolutely a real risk of social tension, and we're very mindful of the importance of social cohesion, as are host governments. And I think one way that we address that is, as I said, we work with vulnerable host populations as well as refugees and asylum seekers. So we have a really interesting project in Amman that we partner with Citibank on, where we provide enterprise training for young people in the capital. And that includes refugees and host communities on how to develop their enterprise, you know, what it would take to build their sort of dream. And for those who are successful, they'll receive a business grant. And so we're very mindful of that. Something that I have noticed in some of the places that we work is that we have a lot of volunteers from the host community as well. As much as there can be tensions, there can also be a real welcoming response. And I would say that comes from sort of neighbours, but it also comes from local business as well, who might really appreciate the custom that refugees are bringing to their shops and to their businesses. And so, yes, that's right, there can be social tensions, but there can also be really, there can be great moments of social cohesion as well.
Yeah, I suppose that the real aim here is to make sure everyone knows that this kind of thinking can bring long-term benefits to both communities. Just a reminder, you're listening to Pocket Economics, the EBRD podcast on how economic ideas help to change people's lives. I'm Vanora Bennett, and today our guest is Daphne Jayasinghe, and we're discussing how we can better support refugees. Daphne, what's the private sector's role here? What can it do to help support refugees and their hosts?
The private sector has an enormous role to play in supporting refugees. They can and the host countries. They can support them through innovation, through through employment. The majority of jobs created in the countries where we work are created by the private sector, so they're vital as an employer. They can also develop important services and products designed for refugees. So we're really glad to see the way in which the private sector have stepped up to respond to the increase in refugees, and really great to see the EBRD playing an important role in facilitating that introduction of the private sector. I think some of the projects that are needed to support refugees, particularly around infrastructure, require private finance. And so we work very closely in partnership with the private sector. For example, we have a project with Western Union at the moment in Jordan where we're exploring the opportunities around business process outsourcing for refugees, and that's particularly attractive employment opportunity for women who can do it online. They also play an important role in changing the humanitarian response, if you like. There's been real advances that mean that we will use more mobile money to deliver cash, for example, in an emergency. So a humanitarian cash transfer.
Does mobile money mean you get it on your mobile phone?
Yes, that's right. And so we'll work very closely with mobile operators to do that.
And presumably that helps both refugees and the unbanked poor in any given country get better access to banking. And so it's that thing we were talking about.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly right. So I think where we can see an increase, for example, in digital infrastructure, then it will benefit all of the communities, particularly remote communities who might not have had digital access previously. So that's exactly right, yeah.
Yeah, we've been very aware at the EBRD of some amazing innovations in Jordan, but I guess this is happening throughout the community where there are refugees and where people are working with them. Why do you think the thinking has started to shift away from the refugee camp paradigm and towards the help refugees be integrated into communities? What was the eureka moment, and how do we get where we are now?
I mean, I think that's a necessary reality that given the length of crisis, the protracted length of crisis, and the sheer numbers, that we are seeing more refugees out of camps and in urban settings. That's a much more familiar context for us to work in now. I think that's partly to do with the length of displacement. As people are displaced for longer periods, they're likely to move out of camps and into cities, and move into cities alongside the local host population as well. And so that has really changed the approach to humanitarian work. We work much more in urban environments now. And so things like economic inclusion, jobs, working with municipalities are vital to our humanitarian response.
And what qualities in a host nation make it best able to cope with one of these complex situations with refugees, with new ideas about economic inclusion, with the private sector, with the public sector, with everyone playing a part?
No, that's a really great question. I think what we see is, as I said, the importance of an environment where there's inclusive access to the labour market for refugees. And what that really means is there's an enabling environment for micro-enterprise, for example. If refugees are seeking to establish their own business, is that easy to do? Have they got access to it? Have they got access to the finance that they need to set that up? Is there good financial inclusion? Is the infrastructure right? As I mentioned, more and more jobs rely on technology. Is the digital infrastructure available for that? And is the environment right for refugees to legally access work? Is there availability of work permits across sectors so that skilled refugees can take advantage of the opportunity, for example, to set up as an accountant? Or scientists can take advantage of opportunities in the sciences. Now, those are all challenges that we encounter in different contexts. And so to make the environment right for economic inclusion, those are all characteristics that we like to see.
Thank you very much, Daphne. That's unfortunately all we have time for today. If you're interested in learning more about the EBRD's refugee response plan, you can visit ebrd.com. Meanwhile, share your thoughts with us at EBRD on Twitter and Facebook. Visit iTunes, SoundCloud, and ebrd.com/podcast to download previous episodes. And remember that reviewing and rating Pocket Economics helps others to find it. Until next time, goodbye.